Hello, I'm Jennifer.
Hello, I'm Doug.
Hi, I'm Maddie.
And hello, I'm Nigel.
And welcome to the Krewe of Japan Podcast,
A weekly podcast where we take you on audio journeys through Japanese culture.
In this first episode, we're going to introduce you to our crew. We'll be covering how each of us became interested in Japan, why we decided to start a podcast, and why Japan's culture has become so influential to so many people across the world.
For all of our fellow Japan enthusiasts that are listening to this and thinking, easy, anime, manga, and video games, this episode is for you.
You see, on today's journey into Japanese culture, we're going to attempt to discover more ways beyond anime, manga, and video games in which Japan's culture came to captivate the world, and we'll try to answer an even bigger question of why.
To help us on this journey, we sat down for a virtual interview with Matt Alt, the author of one of our favorite books from 2020, Pure Invention: How Japan's Pop Culture Conquered the World.
Matt really helped us understand the evolution and spread of Japan's pop culture and helped us to understand exactly why it resonated with so many of us.
By the end of this episode, you'll be able to see how major Japanese cultural exports changed the world and are continuing to do so today. So stick around until the end of the episode, and you just might be able to better understand why you, be it as a kid or an adult, became so fascinated with the land of the rising sun.
So this is a special episode. We have everyone here today, and since this is our first episode, we wanted to take the opportunity today to introduce you to all of our hosts. In the future, episodes will feature one or two of us, but most likely not all of us, unless it's a really big episode. As a side note, future episodes won't always be this long either. Now, you might also be wondering at this point, what is a crew? Well, Doug, can you explain that really quick?
A crew is an organized group of people who stage parades and events during the Mardi Gras Carnival season in New Orleans. Like a parade full of colorful floats and diverse entertainment with an overarching theme, the Krewe of Japan's goal is to present a broad spectrum of informational and entertaining content about the wonderful country of Japan.
So 2020 was definitely a year for the books. For many people, travel plans got canceled. And as a part of that, those trips to Japan, well, they didn't happen. And with the continuation of the pandemic, many 2021 travel plans are getting canceled as well. We get it. We were a part of that group as well. As time went by and we were looking at our calendars, we were seeing the days that we would have been in Japan. We were thinking about all that we were missing out on. Well, that got us thinking, yes, we might not be able to physically go to Japan, but that doesn't mean we can't bring Japan to us. That's why we created this podcast. We wanted to continue our journey learning about Japan, but we wanted to take you along with us. So in our next segment, we're going to introduce ourselves to you. We're going to share a little bit about who we are and how we became fascinated with Japan. I'll actually kick things off by sharing with you my story. My first interactions with Japan happened in the late 90s and early 2000s. I had an aunt and uncle who were stationed in Okinawa, and during this time, my aunt would actually physically write and mail letters to my family, and she would actually mail little gifts. I was just blown away. Around the time that I'm actually receiving these letters and gifts, it's at a time in my life where I've finally developed a solid reading comprehension ability. And one of the very first things that I am starting to comprehend are these letters of a distant place where people are speaking a different language, the money is different, the food is different, and here are actual items that are sent from this place and I'm holding in my hands. And it just so happens that around this time, a major pop culture wave is also occurring in the United States. This is not the first wave of pop culture transfer, but this specific wave of anime and manga and resources would really come to captivate me. Around this time, you could find me in a Borders bookstore every week, looking for the newest manga, my favorite series, looking at the toys. So I kept this interest in Japan throughout life. And when I got to college, I had this goal in mind that I was going to study abroad. I actually studied film in undergrad, and most of my time in film school was spent studying and watching Japanese films. So in 2016, I had the opportunity to spend a summer studying abroad in Kyoto. And of course, I took that opportunity. And that opportunity for me was like the culmination of so many years of learning and dreaming about Japan, pretty much since I just finished learning to read. I spent a semester in Kyoto studying film, and it was absolutely unforgettable. One of the moments that really sticks out in my time studying abroad was a trip that I took to Nara, Japan. It was a day trip with a few friends, and we spent the day shopping and exploring around the city. And on our way back, we encounter an elderly woman on the train. She strikes up a conversation with us in English, and she ends up actually sharing with us that she studied abroad in the United States when she was younger. Finally, the train got to its destination. She got up to leave, and she turns back and she tells us, "You are always welcomed in Japan." I'm sure that's not how everyone's experience goes, but can you imagine for a person that had been learning and reading about Japan since he was a kid, for that to be the introduction and welcome to Japan? It was absolutely huge for me. My time in Japan that summer really solidified my interest and my desire to learn as much as I could about it. And I'm hoping to continue that through this podcast. So that's pretty much my story.
There are so many points that I totally relate with. When you said you were in the bookstores, I was totally there too, except I was in the drawing section, like looking at how to draw manga and stuff like that.
Yeah, I'm the same way. It was for me, Borders, Walden Books, and then Barnes & Noble. I think Walden Books was ranked highest for me, but then they kind of shut down after a while. Borders came along a little bit after Walden Books was around. And then Barnes & Noble, they literally had like one shelf or one bookcase by the elevators that were like manga, and that was it. And eventually it grew, but yeah, I was the same way. I kind of would I think it was Tuesdays or Thursdays or something, I would always try to go over there and see what else came out, like what they got that was put on the shelves that was new, and trying to peek through and trying to figure out what I wanted to read.
Yeah, I could relate to that too, because I remember, begging my father to drive me to Borders at the time. And so I remember just being in the manga aisle, and with my lunch money that I was supposed to use for lunch during high school, instead I stashed it and was like, this is manga money. So yeah, I totally relate to the bookstore scene.
Okay, so this is really interesting, right? We all have this common connection with Borders and getting us into Japanese culture, right? But when was the last time you went to a Borders?
I know.
Yeah.
It's bankrupt.
So this really important repository for exposing us to Japan is now bankrupt. How do you feel about that?
Sad. I remember that I was just so heartbroken, and then I was forced pretty much to only use Barnes and Nobles, which, like Doug was saying at the beginning, like it was only like one shelf, and it was awful. I remember just being so upset, devastated, and just that's when my collection just was growing very slowly. But then I think Barnes and Nobles was like, this is a thing. This is gonna be a thing for a while. So then they started to invest in like expanding the section, and then that's when my manga collection kind of got out of control.
Yeah, well, that's for me in high school. That's really when I kind of had gotten into like anime. It was like the peak was like middle high school, early high school, late junior high, and then a little bit in college. That was kind of what I guess stoked the flames for me. Being able to like, that was my way of like learning more. Obviously, the internet was there, and you could do research and stuff, but it wasn't as vast with information as it is now. I think now you can find anything.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, Borders was like the center of my universe for a good second. If this is a common factor for all of us, that's pretty crazy. I didn't realize that it had such a profound impact in terms of like inspiring the weeb in all of us.
Yeah, totally. So Doug, tell us how you became interested in Japan.
Okay. When I was a kid, I went to Epcot in I can't remember what year it was, but I was in junior high, and I really enjoyed like going through the countries, and Japan was just one of those that really stuck out to me. Being that I enjoyed and wanted to learn more about Japan, I didn't have a lot of means at the time because, again, I was in junior high back in the 90s, like late 90s, so internet was dial-up, and you didn't have a lot of really good websites. It's like Tripod and GeoCities. I mean, I don't know if anyone out there knows what these are unless you're like over 30. So I had websites and stuff that you try to look for information, but you can't. So like you look to other outlets, and for me, that was, for example, Pokemon. That was just starting to get popular back in the late 90s. And then Dragon Ball, and then the Toonami segment on Cartoon Network was kind of like every day coming from school. I was like, I gotta get rushed home from the bus stop so I can at least catch the back end of it. So you didn't have DVR or streaming back then, so it was like you didn't watch it live, and you didn't set your VHS recorder. You couldn't watch it. So that was kind of like my gateway. There was one other media outlet that kind of piqued my interest, and that was like Karate Kid Part 2. Karate Kid 2, you actually go and see another country's culture, and that was my first real exposure in a movie setting to Japan. I try to pick up a language book and say, I'm going to teach myself, and then get maybe like one chapter in, and then put it down because it's just overwhelming. That really kind of helped set my mindset for college, is that I wanted to learn Japanese. I ended up going to Loyola University in New Orleans. I ended up going and double majoring in Japanese studies and international business. And part of my university studies, I really wanted to go study abroad. But Loyola only had, I think, one program that was available, and it was kind of complicated. So I spoke with the study abroad counselor and my teacher. Turns out, like, they had a Jesuit university in Tokyo called Sophia, or Jochi Dayaku. But they were like, well, maybe we can set up an exchange program. Eventually, Jochi accepted. And so therefore, I was actually, myself and one other student from my Japanese class, we were the first two exchange students for Loyola's Sophia Loyola University exchange program. It was actually right after Katrina hit. I was supposed to leave at the end of September, and Katrina hit in the end of August. And there was a lot of limbo, like I didn't know what was going on, like that. And fortunately, the school reached out to me, and we were able to make some arrangements where I was able to still be able to go. I felt bad going and leaving, but my parents really pushed for me to go because it was an amazing opportunity. We had planned and saved up so much for it. So much was already in motion. They kind of they were like, you got to go. Like, I mean, why? What are you going to do here? So I ended up going, and it was something I'm so grateful for, because it really was one of the pivotal moments in my life in terms of experiences. First time living away from home, first time living outside of the country. So it was a lot of firsts. I came back, finished college, and then I went back because I enjoyed living over there so much in Tokyo. I went back and applied after applying for the JET program. And I was in Fukushima Prefecture in Iwaki City. I taught English in elementary schools around town. That was unbelievable. I had a lot of apprehension about teaching elementary school. I didn't know. I really wanted to do like junior high or high school because I could feel like I could relate more to the kids. And then when I found out it was elementary only, I was like, oh man, what's this going to be like? And then it turned out, oh man, it was fantastic. It was one of the best experiences ever. The kids are amazing. Sure, you have your good days and bad days, but but overall, it was just phenomenal. I came back in 2010. 8 months after I came back, the earthquake and tsunami happened in Japan. And it happened like in Tohoku, which is where Fukushima is located. So it hit close to home because I had friends like that. Iwaki City is on the coast, so I had friends that were like impacted, lost places and stuff like that. So I worked with the local organizations, Japan Club, Jet Alumni Association, and Japan Society, and we had a lot of fundraising events and activities in the city to raise money for Japanese relief efforts. I ended up meeting my wife here, who's Japanese, and once every year or so, we try to go back and visit her family and some friends and whatnot. Up until the pandemic, we've been going back pretty frequently. I look forward to that trip every year, and I'm looking forward to when we can go. And that's pretty much my journey. Sorry, was that too long?
What? Are you kidding? That was amazing.
I didn't realize that you were the first one to go to Sophia, because that's like a program that's still alive and well, and that's so cool.
Yeah, I think that stood out to me the most too, Maddie, from Doug's story, is that just like your university, even though they didn't have a program that specifically spoke to you, they were willing to work with you and find something that really spoke to you.
Yeah, way to spearhead it, my dude.
Yeah, it was myself and one of my classmates, Jesus. Wherever you are, Jesus, maybe you're listening. I don't know.
So you spent 3 years as a jet, and that experience, what would you say taught you more about Japan? Your time studying abroad, or that your time as a jet?
So it's tricky because my first time as a study abroad student, that was my first exposure to Japan, like firsthand. So everything was new, but it was in Tokyo, so it was like a big city feel, living like the hustle bustle life, just trains every minute of the day, getting around super crowded places. There's anything you need at any point in time is easily accessible. Jet was my town it was a city, but it's a city that kind of absorbed smaller villages and towns around it. So it was a city in name, but it was more of like, it was a small town feel. And I mean, you can go 15 minutes out from my town and it's like countryside mountains. So I got a very different experience from both. I got both ends of the spectrum almost.
So from there, we're actually going to pivot over to Maddie. Maddie, tell us why you became interested in Japan.
Yeah, gladly. I would watch Toonami, particularly every Friday growing up with my grandma. I would get dropped off at her house and we would get some food, and I would watch anime with her, and it was just like my favorite part of the week. It was things like Yu Yu Hakusho and like Rurouni Kenshin and like Sailor Moon, and I mean, I just ate it up. At the time, I don't think I really understood what the link was between all these cool shows, right? Like, I just loved the aesthetic. It was probably around middle school that I found myself particularly drawn to Cardcaptor Sakura. I was like obsessed with it. It was the first show that I ever watched in full Japanese, which also got me interested in the language. I went to like a French American school growing up, so I always was kind of like thinking from the language perspective. So I wanted to understand the language too. And so, I would practice hiragana in like my textbooks and my notebook. It drove some of my teachers nuts. But I didn't really care. I thought it was really cool. Then came the realization that Japanese people had like an epic music scene. And I was really into boy bands like Johnny's Entertainment and Avex. I met a lot of friends online through it from all sorts of different countries, people I'm still friends with to this day. When I was around 14, I actually got the chance to go on like a language exchange program, and we did like a homestay, and it was just like such a magical experience for my young little mind. And that's something that's so wonderful about Japan, I think, that you can just stumble into these natural places that just feel so spiritual. We did like day trips. I got to visit Hiroshima and Kyoto. I had some language stuff in Okayama. I'm now kind of like perpetually studying for the JLPT because I think it would be really cool to like finalize that language experience. And I'm still like always listening and looking for new Japanese music. Of course, I still keep up with anime and manga to some degree. Along with Doug, I was selected to go to Matsue as like a representative of New Orleans. And that was like just a really important and meaningful thing for me because it kind of like brought this center of interest that has been omnipresent in my life that I had kind of pushed aside for a while. And I'm really grateful to have it back and, well, to be a part of it and to be a part of the Japan Society and now doing this podcast with y'all. So that's kind of my story in a nutshell.
So one of the things that I found very interesting was that you used to watch anime with your grandma.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much she actually liked it, but she loved that I loved it. And she actually died kind of young in my life. So I think that part of what drew me to, now reflecting on my whole life, the reason it's so dear to me is because it's, I have these foundational, really fond memories.
Right. That's very interesting.
Yeah, what spoke to me is that you were saying how like you were watching all this anime, like Cardcaptor, Sailor Moon, Hamtaro, and I did the same thing. And just like you, I had no idea that it was connected to Japan. I was just watching it because, like you said, the aesthetics were nice. And honestly, the storytelling too with anime is so different from like regular cartoons. So there was something different about the animation and the storytelling that was really so unique. But I just thought it was regular cartoons and they just improved on everything. But it was actually from Japan. So yeah, I totally relate to you with that.
That's so it. And I didn't mention it, but Fruits Basket was one of those, finding that manga and anime was one of those huge moments of like realizing that it was different storytelling, like identifying with this different level of culture that I couldn't really find in the United States.
In addition to that, because I actually watched and read Fruits Basket too, it was pretty good. But completely different note. You had mentioned Matsue, and I didn't intentionally leave it out, but they're just was one of the more recent ones. In fact, it was like 6 months before the COVID shutdown, but it was my last chance to go to Japan actually prior to all this stuff going on. So it's definitely a lasting moment in memory for me. I had never been out that way. And I know you had mentioned that you had been in Okayama, but not over in Matsue. So like, it was just such an amazing opportunity. And it wouldn't be an opportunity we had if it hadn't been for Japan Society. That was something I'm really, really thankful for.
Yeah, I actually remember I also have an international business degree from Loyola. That's something Doug and I have in common. And I remember like going to this conference about international business, trying to like keep my degree relevant to my life. And I came back from it thinking like, is there like a Japan something I can do in this city? And I looked it up and like y'all's annual meeting was right then and there, like that week. So I like signed up for it and got immediately roped in to do like Children's Day with Sam. And I think I'm going on a little bit of a tangent about how cool the Japan Society is right now, but
no, I think it's important, to all of us, and it's a really, it's the reason that this podcast is even happening. We all met through the Japan Society, and the Japan Society does a lot of work to build those cultural bridges between the United States and Japan. So for that, it's a wonderful environment, and so thankful of it as well. So with that, I'm actually going to turn to Jennifer. Jennifer, how did you become captivated with Japan?
I was a young girl in the mid 90s, and that's when I was starting to choose myself what I wanted to watch on the television. And I would choose, Pokemon and Hamtaro, Sailor Moon, Cardcaptors. But I never really knew that it was anime and that it was from Japan. Like I said, I just thought it was regular cartoons and that's what it was. So I just kind of kept on going through life, watching anime without realizing it until in 7th grade, there was a girl in my class who was getting really aggressively made fun of. I got bullied myself for various things, so I didn't like seeing other people get bullied. So I kind of observed what they were bullying her for, and she was reading something. I was like, okay, what is she reading, and why is it such a big deal for everyone else? So I approached her and I asked her, what is it that you're looking at? And she showed me, and it was something so amazing at the time that I had no idea what it was, never seen it before. And she was reading it, differently, and the drawing was so different. I was like, wow, I love it. Can I borrow it? So she let me borrow her manga that I didn't know it was manga at the time. Finally, I gave her her book back and she was like, do you want to read more? And I was like, sure, there's more? That's how it began. She taught me the world of manga, which is very prominent in my life today. I got into high school and she went somewhere else, so, our friendship didn't last too long, but the effects did. I finally found out, manga came from Japan and manga is adapted into anime, and oh my gosh, these cartoons, they're anime. I really just kind of used manga and anime as an escapism, honestly. I was having a really tough time adjusting to high school life. So then I kind of developed an interest in, okay, well, I know so much about anime and manga now. What about Japan itself? So I did my research and I was looking up YouTube videos, and at the time YouTube was kind of like not as high quality as it is now, but it was still good information. And looking stuff up online, I was like, oh, this stuff is so cool, too bad, it can't be really prominent in my life. And then that's when college came around. Even though my university didn't have any particular Asian studies program or anything, they had a study abroad program for Japan during the summer. And I was like, I need to do this my freshman year no matter what. Nothing's gonna stop me. Except my parents were very, very not cool with the idea. I still remember to this day my father saying, what do you need to go to Japan for? Everything you need is right here. My parents are pretty supportive now. So yeah, I went to study abroad finally, got their approval, and had the best summer of my life. I studied Japanese language and Japanese literature while over there. And I came back, and that was the worst experience of my life coming back. I remember crying on the train, crying on the plane, crying when I landed. My initial thought was, oh my god, I'm never coming back again and it's gonna be the saddest thing ever. But then, my husband, who was my boyfriend at the time, he finally was understanding, that this wasn't just a hobby for me, it really meant so much to me and so much more. So he was like, listen, this won't be your last time, I promise. So for our honeymoon, we went to Japan and we had a great time. It was a 2-week kind of vacation and it was great. I created Japan Therapy, which is my blog. It was first a blog. And I got such a great response from it, from my friends and just people that I met over the years. My goal in life was to always just be involved in Japan as much as possible. And so the same woman who did the study abroad program calls me and says that, she's going to retire from the job and that, she's looking for someone to take over. And she's like, listen, I know you're not looking for a job. You're very settled in your current job, but I know this is something that you probably wanted. I was like, you're not wrong. It is. So I started that job in 2018, still working at that job, and I get to take students like myself that I was to Japan, and it's extremely rewarding. So yeah, that's my overall story.
That's fantastic. I was kind of in the same boat when I came back from Jet. I didn't know what to do with myself. I was unemployed for like 4 months. I applied for multiple jobs, trying to find something where I could use an international business degree and maybe tap into something Japanese along the way. Didn't pan out. So the fact that you were able to find like a way to ingratiate yourself in a career that's centered around like going back and visiting, because like, it looks like you get to go now pretty frequently, right? Like once a year.
Yeah, every summer. Obviously not this past summer,
Yeah.
and God knows what this summer looks like.
Right.
But yeah, it's supposed to be every summer. And even just not the job. Like even if I didn't have the job, I'm glad that I gained all these outlets that I can use to really get my expression of Japan out there, like this podcast.
Yeah. You know, the other thing that I caught on too was you mentioned the hardest part was coming back, and I totally like it hits close to home, because every time just a small trip coming back is tough, but after Jet I was a mess. Like I definitely had a lot of really close friends that I was not going to be, that were going back to their home countries like Canada or England or Australia, that who knows when I would be able to see them again. And I would never see them again at all in the same place like I had for the previous 3 years. So like that hit so close to home, because coming back was really tough. Like reverse culture shock is real. And,
yes.
And I totally feel it.
I felt that too. When I came back from Matsue, I was crying like that whole plane ride, and then the next day too. I just and I'm sure I cried when I went the first time too.
Yeah, now that we're talking about it more, and like I'm kind of lingering on the thought, like I can literally feel the exact same way I felt that day.
Okay, so that wraps up our journeys into Japan and its culture. But chances are, if you're listening to this, you've been captivated by it too. So for this next segment, we're actually going to take a deep dive into why. Why is it that Japan's culture and products resonate with so many of us? When did this start to happen? And what were some of the key early products that paved the way for our interest in Japan today? So for this next part, we reached out to a special guest to help us on our journey.
After Japanese ports opened in the 1850s, its first cultural exports came in the form of art, mainly woodblock prints and things like that. And that kicked off this kind of fad for things Japanese in Europe and England, and to a certain extent America, called Japanism.
That's Matt Alt, a Tokyo-based author and translator. In 2003, Matt moved to Japan and founded his own company, Alt Japan, which specializes in localizing video games, comic books, and other forms of entertainment into the English language. Matt recently wrote the book Pure Invention: How Japan's Pop Culture Conquered the World. It's a fantastic read, which really combines Matt's insider experience, his linguistic skills, and his investigative insight to deliver a story about how Japan's pop culture became so influential in the United States.
And that basically transformed Western ideas about what art could be. Up until that moment, art was all about like kind of religious or like aristocratic sort of themes, but Japan, with people like Hokusai and Hiroshige and people like that, were portraying the everyday. And that really had a huge impact on people like the Impressionists. And it not only had a big impact on artists, it had a big impact on all sorts of designers and business people. Tiffany's reoriented itself to be more Japanese in their own style of fashion. And that continued on throughout the 20th century. And then as Japan modernized and became this started Asia's first industrial power, some of the first things they exported were toys. And in the 1920s and 1930s, they became so successful as toy exporters that the American toy industry actually asked for tariffs to be put on Japanese toys to kind of block them from taking over the American toy industry. And this is really interesting because it's a kind of prelude to all sorts of trade friction that's going to happen with Japan and the West.
Of course, all of this came to a grinding halt during World War II, and Japan would look remarkably different by the end of the war.
In the years after World War II, Japan made a comeback as an industrial power as it rebuilt itself, but made in Japan was now a joke. And that was the image of Japan for a very long time after World War II. They made cheap stuff, cheap $1 blouses, tin toys that fell apart after a couple uses, those little umbrellas and your tiki drinks, matches, just cheap stuff. That was Japan's image. And that didn't start to really change until the 1960s. Tellingly, the first manufactured product that appeared on the Japanese marketplace was a toy. It was a toy Jeep based on the American military Jeep. The gentleman who made it out of tin cans that he scavenged from American military bases. And I just think it's really telling that this first product was a toy, and that it was bought not only by kids, but by adults who wanted to give it to kids who'd suffered so much during the war years, but also for themselves as this kind of way to tame the conquerors by holding the Jeep in their hand.
In fact, you can still find some of these tin Jeeps on the internet.
Tin toys were some of the first Japanese products that foreigners came into contact with. And ironically, many of those toys were in the form of the exact same military weapons, such as B-29s, that had bombed Japan into submission during the war. So it's a really fascinating pivot. It's very pragmatic. Like the people who made these toys did it with a kind of heavy heart, but also pragmatically knowing that it would sell to what was then the biggest market in the world.
So the tin toy would be one of the first notable cultural exports following World War II. But we wanted to know what came next.
The product that probably single-handedly put Japan back on the map was the transistor radio. It wasn't invented in Japan, but it was arguably perfected there by Sony, who made this little pocketable, they called it, radio that became this huge hit in the late 1950s, to the point where it was like the biggest Christmas product. And the following January, there was actually a heist.
What Matt is referring to is a heist that occurred in New York in January of 1958, in which 4,000 transistor radios were stolen from a warehouse in Queens, New York. This heist was notable not only because the robbers stole $400,000 worth of transistor radios, but because they left all the other brands of radios behind.
Transistor radios that you can hold in your pocket, now we think of them as really old-fashioned, but they were really the kind of iPods of their day. Up until that point, radios had been this giant pieces of furniture, and it was the Japanese who instantly, and Sony in particular, who grasped that smaller was better.
This really helped to kick off a whole revolution of tiny electronic devices, and that really helped to transform Japan's image into more of a global cutting-edge competitor.
It was a really just kind of a revolutionary moment for not only for electronics and for Japan, but for like listeners everywhere, consumers everywhere who could now suddenly listen to music on the go. That's a really key thing here. When Japan reaches out through consumer products, it's producing these things, but it doesn't know how they're going to be consumed. You can't control that as a manufacturer. So the story of Japan's rise as a kind of, whether it's a manufacturing superpower or as a fantasy superpower, which is how we know it now, is partly about Japan, but it's also in a big part about us. It's a big part about how we use these things that they made in ways often that they weren't expecting. Now, the transistor radio was probably the earliest example of this, and it was used as it was intended. But as the products Japan made got more and more complex, often they were used in ways that they didn't quite expect. But the transistor radio is exactly where that kind of boom, where Japan as the electronics master started.
Now, one thing you may be wondering is which company was actually making these transistor radios?
They were made by a company that in Japan was called Totsuko, the Tokyo Tsushin Kogyo Kabushiki Gaisha, which was a really tongue twister of a name. The gentleman who ran it realized that this was going to be an impediment to any kind of international ambitions they had. So they renamed it with a word that was much more compact, much shorter, easy to pronounce in multiple languages, and most importantly, didn't sound Japanese at all. It was Sony. When they sold these radios under the Sony brand name, they didn't hide the fact they were Japanese, although famously Akio Morita, later the esteemed chairman of Sony, printed made in Japan as small as possible on the radios so that it wouldn't stand out. But particularly when after that heist happened in early 1958 in New York City, the New York Times ran this big article about the TR-1 radios, and they were very open about the fact they were Japanese. And, if you were, sharp-eyed, you would see they were made in Japan. But they certainly didn't put it front and forward that this is from Japan. I think that was a minus at that era, which is exactly why Sony called itself Sony and not like, the great rising sun of Japan company.
So another very interesting thing to note is that this exchange of electronic products is happening just a mere 10 to 15 years after the end of World War II.
That was a big hurdle to overcome as a company who's trying to make consumer products that you're selling to consumers who a decade before you'd been fighting, and it's an amazing pivot, a really fast pivot. That's less than a period of time between like the 2000 and today. So it's a really fascinating and amazing moment in post-war history when Japan kind of reemerged as this electronics and consumer product empire.
Okay, so the next major cultural export was absolutely huge, and you may have heard of it.
1963 marks the debut of anime. And when I say that, I literally mean anime. It was that word was coined by its creator, Osamu Tezuka, who invented the character in the series Astro Boy to distinguish Japanese-made animation from animation, which is the Japanese pronunciation for cartoons of any kind, whether they're from Japan or America or Europe or anything. And it was huge. It was absolutely huge. And it kicked off this boom for anime in Japan. And Japan was enjoying this kind of renaissance of illustrated entertainment, not just on the TV screen, but also in the form of manga. There was nothing like the American Comics Code. The Comics Code was put into place in America in the late 50s to basically stop the growth of comic books into more mature mediums. They wanted to keep it simple. They were worried that it was too gory and grotesque. They were worried that kids' minds were being reprogrammed by these kind of violent crime stories and things. So in America, this Comics Code Authority was established. In Japan, there was nothing like that. So comic books, which already were operating at this kind of high level because Japan had such a long history of illustrated entertainment in the form of its woodblock prints, those same ones that influenced the West after the opening of its harbors. There was a long respect and tradition for drawing illustrations and putting text next to them and making these narratives that wasn't seen as childish.
So without something like the Comics Code Authority, you can probably imagine that manga had a completely different evolution.
By the end of the 1960s, comic books had transformed from this kid stuff into literally the vocabulary for the student revolution. In America, kids were protesting against the Vietnam War. In Japan, they were too, but they were also kind of protesting against their own system. And instead of folk music and rock, they used comic books as their kind of shared lingo. They would deal with topical things, but cloaked in like ninja stories or samurai stories, or famously a boxing story, Ashita no Joe, which is kind of like Japan's Rocky. It kind of nourished the student revolutionary movement there. So you have things like the transistor radio, you have manga and anime. And then around 1970, the karaoke machine gets invented. Another thing that isn't necessarily going to come to the States for a while, but is a kind of key component of Japan Cool, you might say. Another key Japanese consumer product that was made exclusively for salarymen, Japanese office workers to use to let off steam after work. That's what the original karaoke machine was for. And over the years, as these things developed, strange new fields would start to be fertilized and strange new trends would be created. So there's a lot happening in Japan in that post-war era, from toys to consumer electronics to appliances and to new forms of artistic expression.
Okay, if we were counting, we'd have the tin toy, we'd have the transistor radio, we'd have anime, manga, karaoke. But this next product, I would argue, is even more influential than all of those.
The Walkman arriving pretty profoundly changed people's impressions about Japan to, wait a second, why is this tiny country able to make all of this stuff that so like appeals to us in such a deep way? It really was kind of a reckoning, I think. Back in 1979, when Sony debuted the Walkman, not even they had a clue that this was going to be anything more than a kind of gimmick, a kind of wacky gadget for that season. But it totally transformed not only the way we listened to music, but the way that we lived our lives, particularly in urban environments. Sony had been so afraid that the Walkman would isolate people when they put their earphones in that they famously, in the first incarnation, put a second audio jack so a second person could jack in their own headphones, and there was a button to turn off the music so you could talk to each other through it, because they were really worried it would isolate people. it turned out that isolation is exactly what people wanted. You're in this big city, there's jackhammers, there's people screaming, there's horns honking, you know, it's obnoxious. You want to just kind of commute in peace, you know, on the subway, God knows what's happening. There's like all sorts of people like, you know, shouting and talking and doing whatever. The Walkman helped you tune all of that out and create this kind of personal bubble, this media sphere that you curated. No, there's no gatekeepers telling you what to listen to. You listen to it. And it was the first time humanity realized that they could put a fast forward button on life. And now we all experience this in a kind of steroid enhanced way with the iPhone, you know? And it's very telling that one of the first tastemakers to appreciate truly what the Walkman was Steve Jobs. He was actually given a Walkman by then President Akio Morita when Jobs went to Japan to source disk drives for Apple computers. Sony gave him a Walkman. He didn't even bother listening to it. When he got home, he took it apart. Like he took a screwdriver to it and like kind of went through all the little parts, see how this came together, because he knew that this was more than a piece of electronics. It was a new lifestyle. It was a way to live our lives in a digitally enhanced, well, it was analog, and an analog enhanced way back then. But he saw it. He saw it. And so without that Walkman, I think it would have been longer before we saw the iPod and longer before we saw the iPhone.
Okay, so the Walkman was a pretty big deal. And perhaps in our digital world, where you're likely to be listening to this podcast on a cell phone, there's a strong case that it's probably the most important. But now I want to pivot to a different topic. And before I do that, just a heads up. We recorded a full interview with Matt Alt that will release unabridged as a bonus episode following the release of this episode. Be sure to check out that bonus episode where Matt goes into more detail about the video game cross-cultural transfer, Nintendo's decision to keep its name, and how deregulation in the US government opened the doors for anime.
Things like the Walkman, things like the karaoke machine or the Nintendo Entertainment System and later the Game Boy, they really profoundly transformed the way we dream. It wasn't just the way we listened or the way we played, but literally the things we dreamed about were now being inflected by stuff made in Japan. And that would have a really profound impact, particularly on young people. You know, on TV at the time, you know, the grown-ups were all smashing cars with hammers, and like Congress people were like blowing up radios on the steps of the Capitol, like, you know, keep Japan out of our markets. And like, meanwhile, all of us kids were like, damn, bring more of this Japanese stuff in. We love this stuff. Japan was never an enemy, let alone a rival to us. It was like this aspirational sort of place to kids who started to realize all of this stuff was coming from Japan. Up until that point, you know, in the 1930s and 40s, it had been a military superpower. In the 1970s and 80s, it had been an economic superpower. Now in the 90s, it had transitioned into this soft power, intellectual property, ideas, dreams. And that was the big transition into the Japan that we, I think, especially young people, you know, millennials, Gen Xers on, that's the Japan we know. You know, it's never been a rival to us, you know, ever since the beginning. So that's a pretty crazy flip from a literal public enemy number one. Suddenly, it's like the arbiter of everything that's awesome and cool on the planet. In just what? What is that? That's like 40 years, 50 years. I don't think any other country has ever managed to pull off an image makeover like that.
And since we were all so influenced by the pop culture wave in the 90s, we had to ask Matt about it.
The big explosion came with cable TV in the 1990s when the Cartoon Network started putting on a kind of anime block. And they didn't have any of the restrictions that broadcast TV did. So they could show like uncut anime that was made for teenagers in its kind of raw state. Sailor Moon, Cowboy Bebop, Gundam Wing, and get Dragon Ball Z. And that, like, you know, ushered in this huge wave of young people who just be turning on the TV and suddenly it's Toonami or like the anime block. And now, because it's Japanese, is why you tune in. Simultaneously with that, there's a company called Tokyo Pop that is bringing translated manga to the West and putting it in every American bookstore. You know, the New York Times spun off a manga bestseller list because manga kept knocking the American titles off their graphic novel bestseller list. I think that's really telling, you know, because consumers were voting with our wallets. I think the reason that manga and anime hit was because in America, comic books and cartoons were seen as kids stuff. In Japan, they weren't. And so they really hit this like adolescent and tween sweet spot hard in a way that there was nothing that could compete with it in the West. And that's kind of true for all of these fantasy devices. When the Walkman hit, there was no competition for it. You know, there's nothing else like it out there. When Hello Kitty hit, it's not like we had like, you know, Goodbye Doggy or something like that. There was no rival. It was just Hello Kitty. You know, the Nintendo hits, like Atari had self-imploded. So like all of these fantasy delivery devices, including manga, just arrived. They made a beachhead without any kind of opposition at all, which is how they were able to take over manga, were able to take over borders. We're consuming manga, we're consuming anime, we're watching the Power Rangers. So we are kind of subconsciously as young people digesting all of these Japanese tropes, all of these Japanese styles, all of these Japanese forms of expression, even though they're not being explicitly said as such. So when we get older, as we age, you know, and then the turn of the millennium, suddenly we have become connoisseurs of Japanese entertainment, whether we realized it or not. Like now we know about like powering up. Now we know about, oh, of course the five guys are going to get together in a giant robot to defeat the other guy. You know, of course you wear sailor suits when you're, you know, fighting evil and there's talking cats, you know, and guys in tuxedos, you know, all of these things that we've absorbed from all of this anime and all of this Japanese content, all of the Japanese gadgets we've been using, like Walkmans and like, you know, Tamagotchis and stuff, you know, emojis, all of these kind of made in Japan fantasy delivery devices we've been using have so transformed us that now we want the Japanese stuff in real time with as little mediation as possible. It's a testament to, you know, how much our tastes changed and globalized, you know, they're more diverse now because of this. And that's a really good thing.
For more amazing insight into Japan and its pop culture, be sure to check out Matt Alt's book, The Pure Invention: How Japan's Pop Culture Conquered the World. It's available now on Amazon, your nearest bookstore, and even at your library. And like that, our journey into Japan for this episode comes to an end.
Thank you so much for tuning into this first episode of Krewe of Japan. In today's episode, we introduce you to our hosts and explain how Japan captivated each of us.
We also explained why we wanted to start this podcast, and we took a deep dive into why Japan's pop culture resonates with so many of us.
Hopefully by now, your fascination with Japanese culture makes a little more sense. This week, we encourage you to think about your first interactions with Japan. Was it through tech products, toys, or maybe even Japanese film?
Whatever it is, we'd love to hear about it. Tell us on our social media.
On Instagram and Twitter at KREWEOFJAPAN, Krewe of Japan Podcast.
While you're there, subscribe and let us know how you are enjoying the podcast. That's it for today.